There are moments in life when time doesn't just slow down, it stops altogether. When the noise of the world drains away, leaving only the pounding of your own heartbeat and the cold grip of uncertainty. Libya taught me that lesson at 1 o'clock in the morning, on a road that seemed to swallow light itself. They pulled me from the car. And then everything went silent. I've traveled to places most people only whisper about in hushed tones. I've walked through war-torn streets, crossed deserts that could break a man's spirit, and sat with strangers who became temporary companions in the theater of survival. But Libya was different. It wasn't just the danger that hung in the air like the dust from the Sahara. It was the weight of history, the ghosts of empires, and the eyes of people who had seen too much. When I landed in Tripoli, I knew this journey would test more than my courage. It would test my faith in humanity itself. The flight into Tripoli was uneventful, almost deceptively calm. As the plane descended, I could see the Mediterranean stretching out beneath us, a ribbon of deep blue against the golden coastline. From above, Libya looked peaceful, even beautiful. But I knew better than to trust first impressions. The moment I stepped off that plane, the heat hit me like a wall, not just the physical heat of the North African sun but something deeper, more oppressive. It was the heat of tension, of a nation still bleeding from wounds that refused to heal. Tripoli's airport was a study in contrasts. Modern in some corners, crumbling in others. Armed men in mismatched uniforms stood at checkpoints, their eyes scanning every face that passed through. I kept my head down, my movements deliberate. In a place like this, you don't draw attention to yourself. You blend in, you observe, and you wait for your moment to breathe. My guide, a man named Youssef, greeted me with a firm handshake and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He was in his 50s, weathered by years of navigating a country that had become a labyrinth of militias, shifting allegiances and unspoken rules. "Welcome to Libya," he said in accented English. "You picked an interesting time to visit." I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't need to. The evidence was everywhere, in the bullet holes that scarred the buildings, in the nervous glances of travelers, in the way people moved through the streets with a cautious urgency. This was a country trying to find its footing in the aftermath of chaos, and I was a stranger walking into the middle of it. Youssef drove us through the streets of Tripoli, and I found myself captivated despite the underlying tension. The old Medina was a maze of narrow alleyways and Ottoman-era architecture, a reminder of the civilizations that had left their mark on this land. The call to prayer echoed through the air, haunting and beautiful, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Men gathered in cafes, sipping thick coffee and smoking shisha, their conversations low and deliberate. Women, wrapped in traditional garments, moved through the streets with quiet grace, their presence both visible and veiled. But beneath the surface beauty, there was an undercurrent of unease. Eyes followed us as we passed. Not hostile but curious, assessing, calculating. I could feel the weight of their gaze, the silent questions they didn't ask. Who was this foreigner? What was he doing here? Could he be trusted? In Libya, trust was a currency more valuable than oil and far more difficult to earn. That first night, Youssef took me to a small restaurant tucked away in the Medina. The walls were decorated with faded photographs of a Libya that no longer existed, a time when the streets were safe, when tourists filled the ancient Roman ruins, when families gathered without fear. We ate couscous, the national dish, served with spicy tomato sauce and vegetables that had been simmering for hours. The meal was simple but rich with flavor. As we ate from the communal bowl, Youssef spoke about his country with a mixture of pride and sorrow. "Libya is not what the world thinks it is," he said quietly. "Yes, there is danger. Yes, there are problems. But there is also beauty. There is history. There is a soul to this place that refuses to die, no matter how hard they try to kill it." I listened, absorbing his words, understanding that I was being given a glimpse into something deeper than the headlines could ever capture. Libya was a wounded nation, but it was also a resilient one. Its people carried scars, but they also carried hope. And I was about to discover just how fragile that hope could be. As I walked back to the hotel that night, the streets of Tripoli were alive with the energy of Ramadan. Families gathered after sunset, breaking their fast with dates and prayers. Children ran through the alleyways, their laughter a brief respite from the weight of adult concerns. For a moment I allowed myself to feel optimistic. Perhaps this journey wouldn't be as dark as I had imagined. Perhaps Libya still had room for wonder amidst the shadows. But that optimism was about to be tested in ways I couldn't have anticipated. The next day we left Tripoli behind and headed into the mountains of Jebel Nafusa. The landscape changed dramatically as we climbed higher, the heat of the coast giving way to cooler air and rugged terrain. This was Berber country, where ancient villages clung to cliffsides and troglodyte dwellings carved into the rock spoke of a people who had learned to survive against impossible odds. The Berbers, or Amazigh as they call themselves, have lived in these mountains for thousands of years, their culture and language preserved despite centuries of outside influence. Yusef introduced me to a family in one of the villages. They welcomed us with the kind of hospitality that transcends language barriers. Tea was poured, bread was broken, and stories were shared in a mixture of Arabic and gestures. The elder of the family, a man with a face etched by time and sun, spoke about the importance of community, of loyalty, of standing together when the world tries to tear you apart. These were lessons learned not from books but from experience, from survival. As we sat in their modest home, I was struck by the contrast between their simple way of life and the complexity of the world outside these mountains. Here, life followed rhythms that had remained unchanged for generations. Family was everything. Honor was everything. And trust was earned through actions, not words. But even in this remote corner of Libya, the shadows of conflict were never far away. Yusef pointed out the scars on the landscape, buildings damaged by fighting, roads pockmarked by artillery, fields left fallow because it was too dangerous to farm them. The Berbers had survived empires and invaders, but they were still caught in the crossfire of a nation struggling to define itself. As we prepared to leave, the elder placed his hand on my shoulder. His eyes, dark and deep, held a warning I didn't fully understand at the time. "Be careful, my friend," he said in broken English. "Libya is not always what it seems. Trust only those who have earned it. And remember, silence can be more dangerous than noise." I thanked him, not knowing how prophetic his words would become. We left Jebel Nafusa and began the long drive south toward Ghadames, the legendary oasis town deep in the Sahara. 7 hours of desert driving stretched ahead of us. 7 hours of endless sand, shimmering heat, and a road that seemed to vanish into nothingness. Yusef drove with the kind of focused intensity that comes from experience. He knew these roads, knew their dangers, knew when to speed up and when to slow down. I sat in the passenger seat, watching the landscape roll by, feeling the isolation settle over me like a blanket. There's something profoundly humbling about the desert. It doesn't care about your plans, your fears, or your survival. It simply exists, indifferent and eternal. As the hours passed, I found myself slipping into a meditative state, my thoughts drifting between past journeys and the uncertain future ahead. But then, as the sun began to set and the sky turned shades of orange and purple, something shifted. Yusef's posture changed. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror more frequently. His hands gripped the steering wheel just a little tighter. I felt it too, that primal instinct that tells you something is wrong even when you can't see it yet. "What is it?" I asked, my voice low. "Checkpoint ahead," he replied. "Unofficial." My stomach tightened. Unofficial checkpoints were unpredictable. They could be manned by legitimate security forces, or they could be run by militias with their own agendas. There was no way to know until you were already committed. And by then it was too late to turn back. As we approached, I could see the barrier across the road, a makeshift structure of metal and concrete. Figures emerged from the shadows, armed men in civilian clothes, their faces obscured by scarves. Yusef slowed the car, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He rolled down the window, speaking in rapid Arabic, his tone respectful but firm. One of the men leaned in, his eyes scanning the interior of the car. They settled on me. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he stepped back and gestured for us to pull over to the side of the road. My heart was racing now, but I kept my face neutral. Show fear and you become a target. Show confidence and you might just survive. Yusef parked the car and turned to me. "Stay calm. Let me do the talking." I nodded, my mouth dry. The men approached the car again, this time with more urgency. They opened the doors, gesturing for us to get out. Yusef complied immediately and I followed his lead. The desert air was cool now, a stark contrast to the heat of the day. The silence was almost complete, broken only by the distant hum of the wind and the low murmur of voices. They searched the car methodically, pulling out bags, inspecting documents, their movements efficient and practiced. I stood to the side, hands visible, making no sudden movements. One of the men, the leader I assumed, walked over to me. He was young, maybe in his 30s, with hard eyes and a scar running down his left cheek. "Where are you going?" he asked in English. "Ghadames," I replied evenly. "I'm a traveler. Just seeing the country." He studied me for a moment, then glanced at Yusef, who was speaking with another member of the group. The conversation was heated, voices rising and falling in a rhythm I couldn't follow. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the leader nodded. He waved us back to the car. Go, he said simply. We didn't wait for him to change his mind. Youssef started the engine and we pulled back onto the road, leaving the checkpoint behind. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Finally, I broke the silence. What did they want? Money, Youssef said bluntly. And information. They wanted to know who you were, why you were here, who sent you. I told them you were a journalist writing about Libya's history. They didn't like it, but they let us go. I exhaled slowly, the tension draining from my body. But even as we continued the drive, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had just crossed an invisible line. The desert had tested us and we had passed. But the real test was still to come. What do you think makes a place truly dangerous? Is it the violence? The chaos? The lawlessness? I've come to believe it's something more insidious. It's the uncertainty. The not knowing whether the next person you meet will help you or hurt you. Whether the road ahead is safe or leads straight into disaster. Libya had become a masterclass in uncertainty, and I was about to receive my final lesson. We arrived in Ghadames just after midnight. The town was quiet, its whitewashed buildings glowing faintly under the light of a crescent moon. Known as the Pearl of the Desert, Ghadames is one of the oldest pre-Saharan cities, a UNESCO World Heritage Site that has stood for millennia at the crossroads of ancient trade routes. Its covered alleyways and interconnected homes were designed to protect against the brutal heat of the desert, creating a labyrinth of cool, shadowed passages that felt like stepping back in time. Youssef checked us into a small guesthouse run by a Tuareg family. The Tuaregs, nomadic Berber people who have roamed the Sahara for centuries, are known for their distinctive indigo robes and their fierce independence. Our host, a man named Ammar, greeted us with traditional mint tea and a warmth that was a stark contrast to the tension of the journey. We sat in the courtyard, the stars overhead bright and infinite, and for a brief moment I allowed myself to relax. But that relaxation was short-lived. As we prepared for bed, Youssef received a phone call. The conversation was brief, but I could see the concern in his eyes when he hung up. "What is it?" I asked. "There's been trouble in the area," he said carefully. "Militia movements. They're setting up roadblocks. We need to leave earlier than planned. First light." I nodded, though sleep felt impossible now. I lay awake in the small room, listening to the sounds of the night, the distant barking of dogs, the whisper of wind through the alleys, the faint murmur of voices from somewhere deeper in the town. Every sound felt amplified, every shadow seemed to hold a threat. This was the dark side of travel, the side that guidebooks don't mention. The side where fear becomes your constant companion. We left Ghadames before dawn, the sky still dark and studded with stars. The plan was to make our way back toward Tripoli, stopping at several sites along the way, ancient granaries, underground homes, and eventually the Roman ruins of Leptis Magna, one of the most spectacular archaeological sites in the world. But plans, I've learned, are fragile things in Libya. They can change in an instant, shattered by circumstances beyond your control. The drive back was tense. Youssef drove faster than before, his eyes constantly scanning the road ahead and the mirrors. We passed through several official checkpoints without incident, but the closer we got to Tripoli, the more frequent they became. Each one was a test of nerves, a reminder that we were moving through a country where authority was fragmented and loyalty was bought and sold like any other commodity. It was around 1 a.m. when everything changed. We were on a stretch of road between two towns, the darkness complete except for the beams of our headlights cutting through the night. I was dozing in the passenger seat, exhausted from the journey, when Youssef suddenly slammed on the brakes. I jerked awake, my heart pounding. "What?" "Checkpoint," he said, his voice tight. "But this one's different." I looked ahead and saw the barrier, the figures emerging from the shadows. But something about this felt wrong. There were no lights, no official markings, no sense of order. Just men with guns and faces I couldn't see. Youssef slowed the car, but before we could even come to a complete stop, one of the men stepped into the road and fired a warning shot into the air. The sound was deafening in the silence of the night. My body went cold. "Get out," the man shouted in Arabic. Youssef translated, his voice shaking. "He says get out of the car. Now." I didn't have time to think. The doors were pulled open, rough hands grabbing my arms and dragging me out onto the road. I stumbled, barely keeping my balance. Youssef was pulled out on the other side, his protests cut short by a sharp command. They pushed us to the side of the road, away from the car, their movements aggressive and purposeful. And then, as I stood there in the darkness, surrounded by armed men whose faces I couldn't see, everything went silent. The wind stopped. The distant sounds of the night faded away. Even the pounding of my own heart seemed to quiet. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. One of the men approached me. He was older than the others, his movements slower, more deliberate. He studied me in the dim light, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke, his voice low and measured. "Why are you here?" I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to remain steady. "I'm a traveler. I came to see Libya. To learn about its history." He said nothing for a long moment. Then he turned to Youssef and spoke in rapid Arabic. Youssef responded, his tone pleading, explaining, negotiating. I couldn't understand the words, but I understood the stakes. This was a moment balanced on a knife's edge. One wrong move, one wrong word, and everything could spiral into violence. The silence stretched on. Minutes felt like hours. I could feel the sweat on my back despite the cool night air. I could feel the weight of their eyes on me, judging, calculating. And then, finally, the older man nodded. He said something to the others and they lowered their weapons. He turned back to me. "Go," he said in English, "and do not come back." They didn't have to tell me twice. Youssef and I climbed back into the car, our movements hurried but controlled. He started the engine and we drove away slowly, careful not to provoke a change of heart. It wasn't until we were several kilometers down the road that either of us spoke. "What just happened?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Youssef didn't answer immediately. His hands were still gripping the steering wheel, his knuckles white. Finally he exhaled slowly. "I don't know," he admitted. "But we're alive. That's what matters." If you've ever been truly afraid, the kind of fear that strips away everything else and leaves only the raw instinct to survive, then you understand what I felt in that moment. Comment below with the word, survive, if you've ever faced a moment that tested you to your core. And if this story has gripped you so far, please subscribe to this channel. There are more journeys, more stories, and more truths waiting to be told. The rest of the journey back to Tripoli was a blur. We didn't stop except for fuel and necessary checkpoints. Youssef was quiet, his mind clearly processing what had happened. I spent the hours staring out the window, watching the darkness give way to the first light of dawn, thinking about how close we had come to disaster. About how fragile life is in places where the rules are written in sand and washed away by the next storm. By the time we reached Tripoli, I was exhausted in every sense of the word. Physically, mentally, emotionally drained. But there was still one more stop on the itinerary, Leptis Magna, the ancient Roman city that once rivaled Rome itself in grandeur. It seemed almost absurd to continue to play the role of tourist after what had happened. But I had come this far, and something in me needed to see it through. Leptis Magna did not disappoint. Walking through the ruins of the amphitheater, the grand arches, the intricate mosaics, I was struck by the irony. This place, once a symbol of power and civilization, now stood empty and forgotten, a victim of the same cycles of conflict and collapse that plague Libya today. History, it seems, has a cruel sense of humor. But there was also beauty in the ruins. Beauty in the way the morning light played across the ancient stones. Beauty in the silence that filled the empty streets of a city that once thrived with life. It was a reminder that empires rise and fall, that power is temporary but stories endure. As I stood in the amphitheater, looking out over the Mediterranean, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. About the people I had met, the dangers I had faced, the lessons I had learned. Libya had tested me in ways I hadn't expected. It had shown me the best and worst of humanity, often in the same breath. It had reminded me that travel is not just about seeing new places, it's about confronting the unknown both outside and within yourself. Youssef found me there, standing in the center of the ancient stage. He didn't say anything, just stood beside me in silence. Finally I spoke. "Thank you," I said, "for getting us through." He nodded. "In Libya we learn to survive. It's all we can do." Those words stayed with me long after I left the country. They stayed with me as the plane lifted off from Tripoli, carrying me back to a world that felt both familiar and impossibly distant. They stayed with me as I unpacked my bags, as I processed the photographs, as I tried to make sense of what I had experienced. There are places in the world that change you, that force you to see yourself more clearly, stripped of the comfortable illusions we build around our lives. Libya was one of those places for me. It wasn't the danger alone that changed me, it was the silence. The silence when I was pulled from the car. The silence when I stood facing armed men in the darkness. The silence that followed, heavy with uncertainty and fear. That silence taught me something profound. It taught me that courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. It taught me that trust is the most valuable currency in uncertain times. And it taught me that survival, true survival, is not just about making it through the moment. It's about holding on to your humanity, your compassion, your capacity for wonder, even when the world around you seems determined to strip those things away. Libya is a country of contradictions. A land of ancient beauty and modern chaos. A place where hospitality and danger coexist in uncomfortable proximity. It's a country that the world has largely forgotten, written off as too dangerous, too unstable, too broken to visit. But the people I met there, people like Youssef, like Ammar, like the Berber elder in the mountains, they haven't given up. They continue to live, to hope, to believe that their country can be something more than the sum of its conflicts. And perhaps that's the real lesson of my journey. That even in the darkest places there is light. Even in the silence, there are stories waiting to be told. Even in the face of fear, there is the possibility of connection, of understanding, of transformation. So what do you think? Was it worth it? Would you take that journey knowing what I know now? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Share your own stories of survival, of fear overcome, of journeys that changed you. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel, because this is just one story among many, and the world is full of places that deserve to be seen, understood, and remembered. Thank you for traveling with me through the darkness. Until the next journey, stay curious, stay brave, and never stop seeking the truth.